Welcome back. In this video, we would introduce you to the need for something called centralized application configuration or centralized microservice configuration, and we would talk about how Spring Cloud Config Server helps us to implement it. When we talk about the microservices that we would be creating in this course, we would be creating something called currency calculation service, currency exchange service, and limit service. The details of these services are not really important for now, but the most important thing that you need to understand is each of these microservices has its own configuration. I would not be surprised of hearing enterprises with more than 100, 200 microservices. So each of these microservices have their own configuration. This configuration might be things like database configuration or any external service configuration or the typical business logic configuration as well. There are a huge variety of things that would need to be configured for each microservice. The thing is, there are multiple environments for each of these microservices. For example, the currency conversion service might be having two QA environments and one each of all others. The currency exchange service might have a lot of load on it, and it has 4 production environments and 2 QA environments. So what we are talking about is the fact that there are multiple microservices, sometimes hundreds of them, and for each of these microservices there are multiple environments, and some of these environments might have multiple instances of the same microservice. So we are talking about managing configuration of a lot of different instances of different microservices. Managing the configuration individually for each application, each environment is a very difficult thing. And that's where centralized configuration comes into picture. Spring Cloud Config Server says, okay, you put all the configuration for your applications in a Git repository, and I would take care of managing the configuration and providing it to the specific microservice. If limit service says, okay, I would want the configuration for dev environment for limit service, the Spring Cloud Config Server would be able to provide it to it. If currency calculation service says, okay, I would want the configuration for third instance of the production environment, Spring Cloud Config Server would be able to provide it. The Spring Cloud Config Server would act as the centralized microservice configuration application. All that you would need to do is to put all the configuration for these applications for different environments in a Git repository. And you can connect the Spring Cloud Config Server to the Git repository, and it can serve the configuration based on the different needs of the different instances in different environments for all the microservices. In the screen here, we are configuring the values for different instances of the limit service. So what we are configuring is limit service, the default values in here. Over here, we have the properties for QA environment, and over here we have the properties for dev environment. And based on the requests, based on how the limit service requests, the Spring Cloud Config Server would be able to provide the appropriate configuration to the limits service. What we'll do in the next subsequent steps is use limit service as an example. We would create a simple limits service which would pick up a couple of values from configuration, and we would connect the limit service to the Spring Cloud Config Server. Spring Cloud Config Server needs a Git repository. We will also create a Git repository and connect the Spring Cloud Config Server to that Git repository. Other than that, we would discuss how to store the configuration for multiple environments of the limit service and also retrieve the configuration for a specific environment. If all this sounds a little confusing, don't worry at all. We would be discussing about this in the subsequent 10 steps, and I'm sure by the end of these 10 steps, you'd be very clear about the need and how you can configure a Spring Cloud Config Server. Until the next step, bye-bye.